So last week, Alistair mentioned the popular BBC series called Who Do You Think You Are? And in this BBC series, celebrities are invited to dig into their family history and discover who their ancestors were. We human beings are a curious bunch, aren't we? We all have questions about who we are and where we come from, and why we're here as well. And finding answers to these questions can take a whole lifetime for some, but actually God hasn't left us in the dark. And right at the beginning of the Bible, we can find a lot of answers. So today, we're going to dive into Genesis 1, because it was written to answer some of humanity's biggest questions. Who are we? What is our purpose? And who can we put our trust in? The most important thing is to come to this text with the right questions. Now, if I were to give Alex Wilton a science book, a science textbook, and asked him, what is love? Well, he might have some answers for me, but the textbook, the science book, which is filled with brilliant stuff, probably wouldn't be where he'd look for that answer, and he probably wouldn't be able to find any of that answer in the book itself. Similarly, if I gave Peter a book of poetry and asked him, how long do I need to bake a souffle in the oven for? The book that I've given him wouldn't really be very helpful. So in the same way, Genesis 1-3 has become one of the most contentious and misunderstood parts of the Bible because people keep coming to it with the wrong questions. It's an ancient origin story, not a science textbook. The language and structure is poetic, but it's not just a poem. When we come to study any ancient text within Scripture, it's really important to remember that although it was written for us, it wasn't written to us. So to understand it well, we need to put ourselves in the context of the ancient world and the Israelite people who it was written to. Now, these days, we understand things to be real, to exist, when we can perceive them with our five senses, our sight, our touch, our hearing, all of that. But in the ancient Near East, people believed that something came into existence when it was given a role or a purpose. So existence and purpose were tied closely together. And this understanding can really change the way that we look at the Genesis creation story. Now, yesterday it was our son Benjamin's birthday, and our kids are really into the Minions films at the moment. I don't know if you've seen any of them. But because of that, I decided to make him a minion cake. So this is his minion cake. This is Kevin. Kevin the Minion. Now, probably all of us would say that that cake came into existence when I took it out of the oven, when it changed from liquid to solid and it was a solid cake. Or some of us with a sweet tooth may say it came into existence when it had been fully iced. But either way, we would have that kind of understanding of when that cake existed. But in the ancient Near East, they probably would have said that cake came into existence when it had candles on the top and was presented to Benjamin as we sang Happy Birthday, because it became a birthday cake when it was fulfilling its function. In the same way, the Israelites would have understood the creation story in Genesis as a description of the time in which God gave purpose, function, and harmony to all the elements of the created world. That's not to say he didn't create everything. He absolutely did, and that's really clear in Genesis 1, verse 1. But perhaps physical, material creation wasn't the focus of this particular story, just as it wasn't actually the focus of any of the origin stories of the time. So let's have a quick look at the beginning. Genesis 1:1 tells us that God created everything, the heavens and the earth. But then in verse 2, we see it refers to the waters. And in doing so, it tells us that physical, material stuff existed before the whole creative process described in the rest of the chapter began. If this origin story was all about material creation, then wouldn't it be a bit strange to start after matter had already been made? What follows in verses 3-31 describe a process which is not primarily about material creation, but rather about the process of creating function, giving roles, and establishing order. God creates time, weather patterns, ecosystems, habitats, and gives functions for every creature within them. Here God is creating a beautiful, harmonious creation in which he can dwell. Creation in Genesis 1 is really all about temple building. Now, in the ancient world, temples were built in order that a deity would rest in them. And in the story of Genesis, God creates the heavens and the earth as a dwelling place for himself. God rested on the seventh day of creation, not because he was tired and he wanted to put his feet up, but because he had built the temple in order to dwell in it. The dwelling or resting of day 7 is therefore the climax of the creation process, when God's beautiful garden temple is complete and it can begin to serve its purpose. Now, many scholars like Rick Watts believe that Genesis was written by Moses during the time that the Israelites were wandering in the desert. And during their time in Egypt, the Israelites grew from quite a large family into a huge nation. And so when they were finally rescued from slavery and God sent them to go into the promised land, they were just starting to establish themselves as a nation, as God's people. And at this stage, they really needed to know who they were, what their purpose was, and who to put their trust in. They didn't really need to know how God created butterflies or how many days it took him to form the mountains. And these are really interesting questions that I'm saving up for heaven, but they're not the ones that Genesis is trying to answer. So firstly, let's look at these questions, these same questions that the Israelites were asking back then. Who are we? Who should we put our trust in? And what is our purpose? Firstly, who should we put our trust in? And hopefully this is the easiest one to answer based on the passage. Among all other origin stories, the Genesis creation story is absolutely unique. And that's because of its claim that there is only one creator God who reigns supreme over the whole cosmos and yet continues to be involved in a personal way with his creation. He not only created human beings, but since then has been continually involved with their lives, caring for their needs. So who should we put our trust in? The God who created us and loves us and sustains us. Now for the other two big questions. As I've already said, for the Israelites, existence, reality, and purpose were closely linked. So as I draw our attention to just 3 parts of the passage, we will see that each one gives us an answer to both of those questions. Who are we and what is our purpose? So, first of all, we are image bearers of the living God. When building a temple in the ancient world, the last item that would have gone into the temple would be an image of the god that the temple was for. For example, in a Greek temple, a statue of the god or goddess would be the final thing to go in. And in the temple building act of creation, the final thing that God puts in his temple are human beings who bear his image. In Genesis 1:28, God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. As bearers of God's image, this indicates that they were to populate the earth, not merely with just more people, but with more image-bearing people who would reflect God's glory. God intended that his people would extend the boundaries of Eden by reflecting his image and presence throughout the world. In the same way as we bear God's image today, we are called to extend the boundaries of his kingdom by reflecting his love and nature to those around us, to draw others into his kingdom as it grows. Now, in medieval times, the banner of the king was held up by someone called the standard bearer in battle, so that when everyone was in the battlefield, they would be able to see that the king was alive and he was fighting with his army. Similarly, we are called to hold up the image of our king, no matter what the world throws at us, knowing that he is fighting for us and with us for the good of the world and for the people that he created. So whenever we serve other people wholeheartedly, whenever we put our neighbor first, whenever we stand up for the vulnerable and the weak, whenever we protect God's creation, we bear the image of our King. We hold up his banner to the world. Secondly, we are priests. Genesis 2:15, which we hadn't quite got to in that passage, it tells us that God put Adam in the garden to cultivate and keep it. And the Hebrew verbs that are used here are called abad and shema, which mean to serve and to guard. And they're most frequently used in the Old Testament to describe priests who serve in God's temple and guard the temple from unclean things entering it. So Adam's role is therefore as a guardian of sacred space, not simply a gardener. In 2004, I went interrailing around Europe. It's a long time ago now. I do just about remember it. I went with a friend from school, and we had a wonderful time, but it was a little bit cold in Munich, so we thought, where should we go next? It's going to be warm, and we decided to go to Rome. We really wanted to see St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel while we were there. So off we went from our youth hostel one morning, and despite the heat, we'd remembered that there are certain dress codes for entering into St. Peter's Basilica. So we had covered shoulders, I think I had a cardigan on. But unfortunately, as I set off, I'd forgotten that there was a little penknife that I'd bought for camping purposes that was in an inner pocket in my rucksack. So off we went to St. Peter's Basilica. But as we queued to go in, I could see the Swiss Guard, who we can see in that picture. They weren't dressed exactly like that. That's their kind of regal outfits. They have different outfits for kind of day-to-day tasks. And the Swiss Guard were checking people's bags as they went in. And suddenly I remembered, and my heart dropped, because I'd been given this penknife as a present before we left. And unfortunately, as we drew closer to the front of the queue, I realized I was just going to have to bring it out and show them and say, I'm sorry, I forgot that it was here. And obviously, they took it off me. So I didn't see my penknife again, but we did get to go into St. Peter's Basilica, and it was absolutely magnificent. Now, the Swiss Guard are there at the Vatican to serve and guard. They serve the Vatican and they guard the Pope. That is their job role. That's their job title. Humanity, in a similar way, is called to serve God and to guard his creation temple. So we all have a priestly role as well as a priestly identity. Thirdly, we are kings and queens. Alongside the priestly role, humanity was given royal authority. In Genesis 1:26-28, God commands Adam and Eve to subdue the earth, to have dominion over it, as a king would govern over his lands. Now, these verses, which have often been manipulated by Western countries, including our own, are not an invitation to plunder and destroy nature's resources for our own personal comfort and gain. This governing would involve careful stewardship, responsible management, vigilant protection to ensure that sustainability of the harmonious order that God had created. So if the whole of creation is to be understood as God's temple, this should have a profound impact on the way we as humans treat the created world and all that live in it. When humans destroy the created world, they desecrate God's holy temple. Now, not long ago, having a low carbon footprint whilst living in a first world country was actually quite difficult, and eating responsibly was complicated. But every year, those things get easier as we have more choices and we become more aware of the impact our life has on the environment. Eating less meat and flying, I have been told by reliable sources, are the two best ways that we as consumers can reduce our carbon footprint. And it's not an impossible task. These days, there are so many vegetarian options in the supermarkets, recipe books, and in restaurants, and there are lots of ways to travel which don't pollute nearly as much as planes. Now, that's not to say I will never eat meat or step on a plane. I've done those things. I will continue to do those things, I expect, in the future. But in recent years, Alistair and I have made a concerted effort to reduce the amount of meat we consume and try and pass on that trait to our children, that they will eat less meat as well. And similarly, when we do think and plan about holidays, we try and avoid flying if we possibly can and go in a different way. I suppose the question that we all need to ask, and I continually want to ask myself, is, do we care enough about God's temple to make changes to our lives? So just a recap of those big questions. Who should we put our trust in? We put our trust in God because he created us, he knows us, he loves us, and he sustains us. Who are we and what is our purpose? Well, we are image bearers of the living God, called to reflect his love to the people around us, and in doing so, extend the boundaries of his kingdom. We are priests called to serve in God's holy temple, to serve and to guard the creation. And we are kings and queens given royal authority to steward, preserve, and protect all that God has made. We're going to finish up now just with a little short time of reflection. And if you're joining us on Zoom, then maybe you'd like to say the words on the slide out loud or incorporate them into a personal prayer. And if you're in church, we're going to have a few minutes, and I'll just invite you to come up to the front and pick up one of these crowns, and then just use it as a kind of prompt for prayer, just to think over our role and our identity as priest kings and priest queens within God's holy temple. So as we begin this time of reflection, I wondered if we could just begin by saying together the words that are up on the slide now. So we'll say together, and you can say priest king if you're a guy, or priest queen if you're a woman. Here we go. I am an image bearer of the living God, a priest queen in God's creation temple. So if you would like to, feel free to come up and take a crown. We're just going to have a few moments of prayer and reflection. Thank you.